it says a lot about our culture that I think is deeply disturbing, and it sets a precedent for presidential authority that if it isn't checked by other forces is very, very, very frightening to me.
On Tuesday, President Trump announced that a boat carrying 11 people and a suspected stash of cocaine was struck in international waters in the Caribbean. Since his inauguration, Mr. Trump has promised to take a hard line on drug cartels, and his supporters say this incident is the most recent and decisive action to send a message that South American fentanyl and cocaine are not welcome on American soil. To give you a little sense of a timeline, back in January on Inauguration Day, Mr. Trump signed an executive order saying that drug cartels and foreign gangs were now to be considered terrorist organizations by the U.S. government. This would include the Venezuelan Tren de Aragua gang, and the MS-13 gang that the Trump administration has since identified as a primary target for deportation. Then, at the beginning of August, multiple media outlets reported that Mr. Trump had signed a secret directive, it's still not been made public, that would allow the U.S. military to target drug cartels, basically saying that the transportation of drugs to the U.S. by these groups was a terrorist activity that threatened the safety of the American people. In recent days, we've seen an uptick on this front as President Trump has issued a $50 million reward for the capture of President Maduro of Venezuela, who he says is head of the gangs there. And the U.S. military has moved more ships carrying troops and weapons into the Caribbean. It would appear that Mr. Trump means business as he works to snuff out the drug trade from the South. As we begin, Mike and Russell, I think we need to say just at the top here that doing something about the drug trade is necessary and good. As someone who has lived in Seattle and saw the realities of drug use on the streets, as someone who has talked with widows who have lost their husbands to addiction, I know drugs are absolutely terrible, and their effects on individuals and families, communities are just heartbreaking. And it seems that Mr. Trump is really passionate about this too. He's recently launched this Make America Fentanyl Free ad campaign. I even saw it the other night when my kids were watching YouTube with me. And we're often critical of the administration on the show, but I'm wondering if, Russell, Mr. Trump is catalyzing on something that's been an American pain point since Nancy Reagan and Just Say No. Is this America's moment, really, to do something decisive about drugs and addiction?
Well, let's set aside this particular action, and we'll talk about that later. I think, of all of the things critical of President Trump that I could say, I do think he has a genuine concern about addiction issues because he references often his brother who succumbed to alcoholism after many years of struggle. I do think that's a genuine concern. I think it also is a concern among the people that he most closely identifies with politically in the country. Because unlike with Nancy Reagan's era, I mean, at that time, you could have at least a huge segment of America that could pretend that drugs were somebody else's problem, that only happens in very urban areas. It doesn't happen out here in rural Kentucky or Illinois or wherever one is. Now what we see is that almost every segment of American life realizes problems with drugs, especially fentanyl, seeing people who are addicted to opioids, seeing people who are killed with fentanyl. And I think it's given people a sense of, there was at one time just a moral disapproval of anyone who has a drug problem. And I think now almost everybody recognizes there are some external forces here that are taking advantage of people in pain. That's a good development. Now, it goes at the same time that we have almost ubiquitous acceptance of marijuana. So there's, some ironies there in history, but there always is. But I do think that there is a concern across the board about what this does.
Well, let's talk about this, Mike, as it plays out in this particular strike on the Venezuelan boat. How do you see this strike as similar or different from other U.S. engagement internationally on what we've called the war on drugs?
The part of the story that actually bothers me the most is that you have the President of the United States authorizing lethal force, saying we're at war with drug cartels, and there's no precedent for him to do this, right? So when we fought the war on terror, there was Congress authorized there was a force authorization for, military force to be used against Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda affiliates. And one could even argue that got stretched. The meaning of that force authorization got stretched over the period of the war on terror to justify all kinds of other actions. But nonetheless, the Constitution's pretty clear that yes, the president is the commander in chief, but if we're going to be saying, if we're going to say we're going to declare war on something, if we're going to say we're going to use military force in a consistent way against a particular enemy, the power to do that is with Congress and not with the president to unilaterally do this. So, number one, you have sort of at the to me the sort of flashing red sign here is that the president is authorizing lethal force without the approval of Congress. The second thing that I think is important to keep in mind in this story is, everything Russell said, I agree with 1,000%. If you followed Trump's rhetoric around this and Trump allies' rhetoric around this, there's a lot of frankly, there's a lot of demagoguery and fear mongering around Tren de Aragua. And they're a scary bunch, and I can get into who they are if that's helpful. It's in this conversation. They're a scary bunch. They're bad people. They're doing a lot of bad things. One thing they're not doing is importing fentanyl into the United States. The drugs that are coming over from Tren de Aragua to the U.S., the primary one that's coming over is something called pink cocaine, which is cocaine that's essentially laced with hallucinogens. Those are the kinds of drugs that are coming over. There's also a bunch of other questions about what was happening. The State Department said, maybe it was Pete Hegseth that said it, that 11 people were killed on this boat in this strike on the boat. Drug traffickers don't have 11 people on a boat. There's no need for 11 people on a boat. If you have 11 people on a boat, that means there's less room for drugs on the boat. So who was on this boat that got killed? Right? We do know Tren de Aragua. If this was a Tren de Aragua vessel, again, there's been very little presented to us about who was on this boat. What was the intelligence that told us that this was worthy of a lethal strike? Why did they break precedent? There's all kinds of precedent for either the Navy or the Coast Guard to interdict these kinds of vessels and raid them and arrest the people that are on them. We know that Tren de Aragua does human trafficking as well. They do sex trafficking. They do other things. So were there trafficking victims on this boat that got blown up by a drone? The last thing that I'll say, because I could rant about this for a long time if I'm not careful, the last thing I'll say about this is the manner in which this was communicated and celebrated online really, really, really bothers me. Right? I have no sympathy for drug traffickers whatsoever. I have no sympathy for terrorists whatsoever. But the idea that with no clear justification, with no clear legal authorization, this video gets presented to the world and it gets passed around online like it's a scene from a Michael Bay movie and everybody's high-fiving over it. And we don't know who was on it or who died or what the reason for this essentially summary execution by the authority of the president, why this took place. It says a lot about our culture that I think is deeply disturbing, and it sets a precedent for presidential authority that if it isn't checked by other forces, is very, very, very frightening to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think about Senator Rand Paul was talking this morning. He and I don't usually agree on foreign policy issues, but I did on this one, in which he was contrasting what happened here with what would happen if a drug trafficking boat, say, were coming into Miami. That's a much closer threat. And what would happen is that boat would be taken over by the Coast Guard. These people would be arrested. These people would have a trial, and these people would be convicted. that's not what happened here. And part of the problem is I really don't know what's happening here.
Right.
But you're right. There's not. If we take the precedent of blowing up terrorist cells and the narco-terrorist sort of comparison, I actually think that's in some ways an apt comparison. But you did have congressional authorization to do that. And even with that, what ended up happening, we ended up in a situation that was far more complicated and deeper than what Congress authorized. Who knows what this leads to and what really is the end game. And part of the problem is right now, there's so little confidence and trust in anything that's being communicated in almost any place in American life that who can know exactly what the situation, what the complete motives are here.
One of the more remarkable figures in the story to the lead up to 9/11 was an FBI agent by the name of John O'Neill, and O'Neill was the guy inside the FBI who was kind of like running the Al Qaeda beat, and Lawrence Wright, journalist Lawrence Wright, who writes for the New Yorker, in his book, The Looming Tower, this Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative story of kind of everything that led up to the 9/11 attacks. It follows O'Neill, and it follows in particular the conflicts that O'Neill had with the CIA over how do we deal with Al Qaeda, how do we deal with terrorists. Again, this is before 9/11. There's no force authorization kind of thing. And one of the conflicts was that the CIA basically wanted to find these guys and just kill them, particularly the terrorists who were responsible for the bombing on the USS Cole, the ones that had planned it, organized it, funded it, and all the rest of it. And there's this fascinating scene in the book where O'Neill is basically yelling at these CIA guys, "This is not how we do this. The right thing to do, and the way to actually sort of show the world what separates us from tyrants and despots and terrorists is that we find these people, we arrest them, we prosecute them, we convict them, and we lock them up," right? That's what I see. And by the way, the tragedy of O'Neill is that O'Neill retired from the FBI and went to work for the World Trade Center as their security director, and he died on 9/11. I believe it was like his first or second day of work at the Two Towers. It's an incredible story. That's what we're dealing with here. What separates us from tyrants and despots is that we do believe in the rule of law. We trust our judicial system. If someone's going to break the law, if they're going to threaten U.S. citizens, again, if Trump wants to go, I genuinely mean this, if Trump wants to go to Congress and make the case that we're at war with drug importers and gangs and everything else and ask for an authorization of force, great. Go make the case. Let Congress vote on it as representatives of the people, and then he has an authorization. I would feel very differently about this. To me, it's this question of precedent, and you don't have to go back very far. You can go back to when Obama sent U.S. military air forces to support the rebels in Libya in 2011, and he did so without congressional authorization. Republicans lost their minds. And that was an instance where Obama was doing that in support of a UN resolution and like a NATO resolution that said we're going to support the rebels against Gaddafi and we're going to protect. Gaddafi was going to send forces into these cities and just massacre civilians as part of this civil war. And so we supported the rebels to try to prevent that. John McCain in particular was one who said, look, I'm all for this, but you need congressional authorization, and without it, you're violating the War Powers Act. That's exactly where we are right now, and the silence of Republicans on this is just making me insane.
Silence of Democrats too. There's almost nothing coming out of Democratic congressional leaders either. And one of the reasons why this actually is an important issue for listeners, for Christian listeners, not just because of American constitutional questions, which we ought to all be concerned about, but also because in the Christian tradition, one of the ways that we have tried to unpack what the Scripture teaches about war, Romans 13 seems to give legitimate authority to the government to carry out war and police powers, for those of us who aren't pacifists at least. and then there are restraints on power throughout Scripture. One of the ways that Augustine and those after him have developed this is to say it's done with a right authority. And so it's not just that it's a right intention, and it's not just that it's carried out ethically and morally in the way that it's done, but it has to be done by a right authority. And if you look at the system, the American system, that's Congress. Now, there's a lot of latitude in terms of what that looks like, but Congress ultimately does this, and that's why we ought to be really concerned about this. Not to mention the fact that, I mean, you think about the sorts of measures that we took even in Libya that you mentioned, Mike. With that, you'd had years and years and years of the American people understanding Muammar Gaddafi and understanding, that the Libyans were the bad guys and this is why they affected us. That's not happened here. So there's been no preparation of the American people for, Gulf of Tonkin, one boat. Lusitania, one boat. So things could go awry really quickly, and the American people just aren't dialed into this. That's a moral problem and a theological problem, not just a constitutional one.
Yeah.
I wonder to what extent the media plays a role in this. John Feely, a former U.S. ambassador to Panama, was quoted in the Wall Street Journal this week as saying, everything usually when dealing with drug traffickers is done to preserve life, he said. What we don't do is just shoot up boats like Netflix likes to pretend. We shoot up in self-defense, but we rarely do that because most narcos just give up. And yes, this was an unconventional situation, but hey, it could be argued the other system wasn't working in the past, and Mr. Trump is a wrecking ball. He's expressed this desire to break down badly working old systems. And I wonder, when we think about this video of the boat exploding that has just gone viral across social media, how has media shaped our idea of blowing up the bad guys? And to what extent is there a call here for Christians in a media landscape like this where we watch this stuff as entertainment?
Yeah, part of the problem is there is no media in any sort of expertise, in sense of expertise in a way that is broadly communicated. So a lot of the traditional media outlets in the United States are diminished and asleep at the wheel. That's so most of this is coming through social media, which means people are already receiving it through all their fragmented lenses, and the rest of actually people trained to deliver news don't seem to know what they're doing right now, and seem to be losing their footing right now. That's part of the danger of it all.
And I want to speak to even just the narrative as you laid it out there, Clarissa, because I think you're right. Like, that's what you hear this a lot. The system's broken, the drugs are getting in, the gangs are getting in, there's violence in the streets, and there's truth to that. Again, like, none of this is to say Tren to Aragua was not a big deal, gangs are okay, anything like that. The question is what kind of government do we want to be living with? Do we want to be living with a government where at a whim, the president can say, yeah, blow that boat up, right? And do so in such a way where there's no expectation of accountability, where he's able to say, here are the reasons we did these things, here's what's going on here, here's who was on the boat, like, here's how we are, here's what gives us enormous confidence that what we did was the right thing. But that's where, to me, that's where all of the issues lie in this. I think that those who are saying the system was broken are right. The system is broken, and the drugs are getting in, and they're getting in all kinds of different ways. I don't think the release of this video had anything to do with that. I think the release of this video was that it was fodder for MAGA to go, look, we blew up a bunch of gangsters, right? And that, to me, is particularly because there's no, because they haven't released any of the intelligence that would tell us who was on the boat and why they're confident that it was what it was or anything else. There's just something grotesque about it. And again, the expansion of presidential power, like, fine. If you're MAGA and you think this is great, brace yourself for giving that kind of presidential authority to just blow people up because you've labeled them a terrorist in an executive order, not with the approval of Congress. Prepare to give that authority to whatever progressive president comes in, 4, 8, 12 years. Who are they going to blow up? And are we okay with that? And I just think that it is. I just think people are not thinking long term. They're not thinking precedent. They're not thinking, what does this say about the stability of our system? Our system was designed to prevent this sort of thing. It was designed to prevent a president from dragging us into a war. We don't want to be at war with Venezuela. Who knows who's going to come in? Like, if we end up at war with Venezuela because Trump is convinced that Maduro is funding the gangs and supporting the gangs and everything else, which, by the way, a National Intelligence Council or a report that was released as part of a Freedom of Information request in April of this year said that Maduro is not supporting the gangs. He's permissive to the gangs, but he's not supportive of them. There's no evidence that what Trump is saying is true. If we end up at war with Venezuela, who's gonna get dragged into that war to support Venezuela? Who are we going to be fighting? Who are American soldiers going to be fighting over? I think the root of this is that Trump is demagoguing the border. This is all about demagoguery at the border, and the border is a crisis. Illegal aliens are a crisis. This goes back to like the Stephen Miller, Steve Bannon fear-mongering about immigrants and trying to turn them into villains and monsters. And so this was fodder for MAGA to say, look, we got some of the bad guys. But the implications of it are terrifying on a human rights level, on a constitutional level, and on a moral level. Human beings are made in the image of God. I mean, there's literally a verse in the Bible that says, don't glory in the death of... Somebody, Russ, you probably know this. I can't remember it off the top of my head. Don't glory in the death of evil men, right?
Even if the boat is filled with kilos and kilos of cocaine and 11 gang members.
Yeah. Send a naval vessel, interdict it, arrest them, and prosecute them. It's that simple. And one of the many crazy, obviously I'm incensed over this whole thing. One of the crazy making parts of this is that when the video comes out, Marco Rubio gives a press conference and gives his sort of rationale for why we had to do this. And someone asks him, where was the boat going? And he says, Trinidad. The next day, Trump says, oh, no, not Trinidad. It was going to the United States. And Rubio, issues a correction. Yeah. It was going to the United States. What is that? Like any rational person can watch that unfold and see exactly what's happening there. The boat was going to Trinidad. Trump, it's like Trump got his Sharpie out for the hurricane and said, no, here's where the hurricane's actually going. If you guys remember that story. Trump rewrites the story, and then Rubio corrects himself, quote unquote corrects, to say that it's coming to the United States. The whole thing stinks to high heaven. Again, we're blowing up a boat full of people for entertainment, for social media clicks and entertainment. And it's part of this larger demagoguery about the border. And I think if we don't take it seriously, like what it says to us morally as a country, I just think it is so reprehensible.
With all of the cognitive dissonance that we've gotten used to over the last several years, I know the answer to my own question. But I wonder, since I do agree with the way that President Trump and Secretary Rubio are labeling the bad guys, these are villains. The narco-terrorist gangs are villains. Maduro is a villain, his authoritarian regime, unsafe for people. Will that have any effect on how we see Venezuelans who have come to the United States seeking refuge, are illegally here, and are now being sent back? Since we do know just how awful this place and the system is for the people who live there, a government that's dictatorial and chaos. I mean, so you have kind of the worst of both worlds in Venezuela. You have the authoritarian strongman, and you have anarchy and chaos with these roaming gangs. Maybe somebody will ask the question, how does this fit together?
Yeah, I would hope.
Yeah. Well, certainly this action is, South America is a hornet's nest right now on a number of fronts, and gestures like this strike on the ship are taking a baseball bat to that hornet's nest. As we close, I wonder what risks we have in damaging the relationship that's really tenuous with Mexico right now. Mexico has been an ally for us in many ways for a long time, and they're really displeased with Mr. Trump's endeavors relating to curbing the drug trade. Mexico is trying to figure out how to keep businesses clear of the drug trade because of this new threat of U.S. sanctions. If even one of them is found to have interacted with organized crime in a way that Politico says provides material support for terrorism. So we know that it's not just Venezuela and Maduro who are concerned. We have Mexico concerned as well. And we really need the cooperation of Mexico as we're trying to figure out the difficulties surrounding immigration. What do you think we risk in damaging that relationship in actions like this? And what kind of mending needs to happen as we try to move forward with the very real concerns that we have about immigration in this country in a way that creates harmony between this relationship that's currently strained?
We're going to have a war, and Mexico's going to pay for the war. That seems to be the slogan that we have. I mean, it's a mess. It's a mess, and part of the reason that it's a mess is because there are so many complexities involved. You can say, on the one hand, we want a good relationship with Mexico because we have to have it, and we don't want to get stuck in the quicksand of Mexico and then Venezuela and everywhere else. And Mexico has pitifully responded to the very real drug problem that is coming from there. Not just with the gangs and the cartels, but with the actual trafficking of drugs. We do have the right to expect more from them.
Yeah. And Trump has talked about sending troops in. I think there was a report early in the administration about the State Department trying to negotiate what that would look like to send troops in to deal with the cartels that are close to the border. It seems to date, nothing has come of that. You also have to recognize, I think, not that I want to provide too much defense of Mexico's administration or anything, but a war against the drug cartels is very expensive, very complicated, and would require a certain kind of military sophistication. The question is, does Mexico have what it takes to actually prosecute that and pull it off without us? I think we'll see. I'm not confident that they do, and I think that's part of why the situation looks the way that it looks right now.
Listeners, we know this is a complicated topic, and one of the joys of our work here at the Bulletin is that we get to wrestle about these kind of headlines as Christians, bringing the gospel to bear on the breaking news that we see. We'll be returning to this topic of the drug trade in a future episode, so make sure that you hit subscribe in your podcast app so you get all of our episodes delivered to your feed as soon as they drop. Listen to the full episode wherever podcasts are found.